did this just to acknowledge that we're gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and the Métis Region number 3, and that wanted to recognize their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship with the land. And in recognition of the day of, I think it's actually called the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. It's occurring on Friday, September the 30th. At Analog Books, we're going to be donating the proceeds of the books of Indigenous books that are sold Thursday, Friday, and Saturday to the Sage Clan. So, and we also have a special storytelling on Friday. We've got one of the Indigenous actors from New West coming, Katie Jo Rabbit, with, and she's bringing her uncle, who is a residential school survivor. So that's going to be really a special thing to do for that day. So I just want to introduce myself. I'm Penny Warris, I'm the owner, and along with my husband Scott, and he sends his regrets that he's not here tonight. He's actually out of town. But prior to opening our store, we actually lived in Crow's Nest Pass, and of course Rick has a big connection along with Jean with Crow's Nest Pass. So we were actually familiar with him before we opened the store. And we moved to Lethbridge about 5 years ago with the intent of opening the store. And we knew that we wanted to be down here on 6th Street. So we had our eye on this building, and we waited for a whole year for it to come available. It used to be Logos. They did our t-shirts. But they wanted to move out to the industrial area, so they had a year left on their lease, so we waited for them. It all came together. We finally were ready, and it was the middle of March of 2020 when it all happened. So we sort of pressed a pause button, but then we kind of sat back and watched, like, around the world, that swell of people wanting to support local, and people wanting to buy books and buy physical books and support bookstores. So we went ahead with it, and we opened in December of 2020. So if there was a right time to open a bookstore in Lethbridge, it was December of 2020. But I wouldn't ever recommend anybody to do that again during a pandemic. But one of the first people that came in with his book was Rick. And we have been surprised and delighted with the amount of local authors there are. We had no idea. We thought, oh, there'll be Rick and a couple others. We have almost 80 titles for local authors on our local author wall there. So we've been super supported by them, and we totally love local authors. So Rick, this is his 4th book, and of course you all know him. He once again draws significantly on his early life through his full-length novels, and his writings honestly capture the unique character of his hometown. And for this reason, he can totally spin a credible and immensely enjoyable tale. So, one of the reasons that we wanted to open the store was to have events like this. So thank you for coming, and it's my honor to invite Rick to come and talk to you instead of me. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Penny. Anyway, when I decided to come and do a reading here, I wasn't quite sure where to bring a reading from, whether it would be in the middle of the book or the end or the beginning. And since Johnny Patu is kind of a character-driven book, although it's a whole life portrayed in it, I thought it would be best to just do the reading right from the first paragraph and through the first chapter. So that's what I'll do. When I'm done, it's going to be maybe a 10 to 15 minute reading, but when it's done, then I'll do a question and answer with you guys if you like, and explain my process and how I got ultimately publishing 4 books. But okay. Now you may be thinking that with a handle like Johnny Patu, our guy might be a grizzled, bearded backwoodsman, a trapper, a hunter perhaps, possibly an earthy environmental activist, and more than likely Indigenous. Nope, you'd be wrong on all accounts. Johnny was, by his typical self-effacing definition, little more than a used car salesman, had been for most of his adult life. At least that's what people around Milestone thought, and he did little to discourage that notion. And his name wasn't really Patu either. It was just plain old John Thompson. Most legends don't start out that way. Certainly John Thompson didn't. In fact, he could be considered less than average, a C-plus student in school, athletically unremarkable, and so featureless in looks that insofar as the opposite sex was concerned, he bordered on invisibility. But it was all of these factors that eventually got mixed into a brew of unexpected providence. Johnny struggled his way through grade 9 and decided that taking his formal education further was a complete waste of time and effort. He wasn't lazy, just non-academic, and reasoned rather pragmatically that the extra 3 years to graduation were not going to do him much good. He learned rather quickly, though, that a pimply-faced 15-year-old dropout's job prospects were seriously compromised, especially given the fact that John's social skills were as remarkably deficient as his timing. This was 1951. The post-war building boom was still on. The lumber mills around this small southwest Alberta mountain town were taking out huge swaths of timber and converting it into post-war cookie box homes as new urban subdivisions sprung up across the country. But with the boys back home from the war and eager for work, these mills didn't need the likes of a skinny, unskilled young school dropout. The area's 5 underground coal mines were always looking for workers, but Johnny's mild claustrophobia closed the door to that option. Besides, you had to be at least 16 to work underground, and if anything, Johnny looked even more callow than his 15 years, not likely to pass even a cursory visual examination. After 3 months of living off the maternal kindness of his widowed mother, he finally landed a minimum wage job as a gas jockey at Ernie's Jiffy Service, a Texaco's gas station that fronted its namesake mediocre mechanic shop. Ernie Greeley was a pretty good auto mechanic, all right, but as lazy as a bunkhouse cat. He spent great chunks of his day in his cluttered little front office, drinking copious amounts of gut-wrenching U-Band coffee from stained and unwashed Fram oil filter mugs, and guffawing with a coterie of his regulars. His pals joked that if their host's old coffee percolator had seen more service than Ernie's large collection of mechanics tools, and they were only slightly wrong. Mixing daily with this collection of his boss's easygoing friends when he wasn't pumping gas quite likely marked a turning point in John Thompson's life. At first he was simply the kid, but as time passed they no longer referred to him as John, but the more familiar Johnny. They often teased him, and strangely, he liked it. For the first time in his life, someone besides his poor old mom and the occasional irate and flustered school teacher was paying attention to him. And for the first time in his life, he felt he belonged. Smiled more often, and in time he was going tit for tat with the teasing he'd endured in silence during his first weeks at Jiffy. He made mistakes on the job, as would be expected from any newcomer, but Ernie was never one to blow his top. Just two weeks into the job, Johnny left the pump running on a fill-up while he had the hood up checking the customer's oil. The nozzle lever didn't click off when it should have, and 2 or 3 gallons of gas overflowed, ran down the side of the car and onto the ground before he could stop it. In panic, Johnny ran back into the office and asked his boss what to do. Did the customer notice it? Was the first question out of Ernie. I don't think so, Johnny replied as he glanced furtively over his shoulder. Good, then go ahead and charge him whatever it says on the pump. And when he's gone, take the old coal bucket over behind the counter with the sawdust in it and sprinkle some on the gas puddle. Don't want to get into trouble with the fire department now, do we? This lack of any real concern led Johnny to realize that this was likely not the first time that Ernie's poorly maintained gas pumps hadn't worked properly. And he couldn't help but wonder just how often this lack of maintenance had worked in his rather than his customer's favor. Often he was about to learn over time. This may have been Johnny's first taste of petty larceny, and aside from a week or so of relentless ribbing from the Jiffy Coffee crowd, the lesson would serve him well in future years, allowing him with some misgiving to rationalize mild deceit and low-level malfeasance. It was clear that his would not always be a life of exemplary conduct. To this unseemly characteristic, Johnny would marry a penchant for opportunism, heretofore unplumbed. Legendary is not necessarily synonymous with steadfast honesty, which Johnny would, at least in his early years, come to demonstrate. But it was one lone incident that would leave the most lasting impression, a morality lesson that came not from his righteous mother, but from Ernie Greeley himself. Being Jiffy's gas jockey meant Johnny had access to the cash register. For a 15-year-old, the temptation was just too great. One busy afternoon, while Ernie was in the back shop, he slipped a $5 bill into his pocket. There was so much money in the till that day that he was certain the missing $5 would go unnoticed. And so it seemed that was the case. Johnny assuaged his guilty conscience with the knowledge that his boss was not the poster boy for honesty either. A week later, it was payday, and Johnny picked up his paycheck on the way out the door at the end of his shift. Taking a closer look at it as he headed down to the bank to cash it, he noticed immediately that it was $5 short of what he normally received. He felt himself actually weaken. His knees went watery and his face prickled as the color drained from it. He shuffled on home, and at the dinner table, overwhelmed with guilt, confessed the theft to his mother. "I can't go back," he bawled. "I just can't." Her face went blank, her eyes coal black, registering a look far beyond mere disappointment. It was a look Johnny had not seen before. She stood up shakily, walked around the kitchen table, and gave him a sharp slap across the face. "You can and you will go back tomorrow, and you will make good on your stupidity. Understand?" Johnny sat still as a corpse, hunched in his chair, his face smarting from the slap. It was the first time his normally gentle mother had ever struck him, and that fact alone woke him to the seriousness of what he'd done. The next morning, still feeling the shame, he arrived at work prepared to be fired. Nothing happened. Nothing was said. Ernie was his normal self and greeted him as he had every other morning. That afternoon, while depositing cash from a gas sale, Johnny reached into his hip pocket, drew out a $5 bill, and slipped it unnoticed into the till. Penance, he believed, for what he'd done. 2 weeks later, he noticed an additional $5 on his paycheck. Ernie's forgiveness was going to require more than a $5 bill returned in the same sneaky manner that it had been taken. He turned around in the middle of Jiffy's lot, pausing for a moment to gather his courage. With that, he walked back in, looked his boss straight in the eye and said, "I stole from you. I know you know it, and I'm ashamed and sorry. If you fire me, I deserve it." His boss turned and walked back into his office. Not another word was spoken. Johnny went back to work the next morning. So that is chapter 1, and it kind of sets up the character. There's a storyline, though, that follows through and threads through the entire book, as you might imagine, because it traces Johnny's life from his teen years right through to the day he dies. So part of it appears on the back cover of the book, but I'll kind of give you an idea what the whole storyline is all about.
Closer to the mic.
Yeah. It was not a future that looked particularly bright for young John Thompson, a 15-year-old grade 9 school dropout. He seemed to possess little that could foretell any path to success.
Closer to the mic.
Closer to the
Yeah.
mic? Sorry. Education can come in many forms, however, and so it was with Johnny. His form took the unlikely shape and presence of Ernie Greeley, a complicated personality who was to mysteriously determine the future of his young acolyte. A detestable character in John Thompson's fledgling career as a used car salesman would, through circumstance, hang the name Johnny Patu on this impressionable young man. It was a name that he would eventually come to reluctantly embrace, a name that would stay with him for the remainder of his eventful life. Gradually emerging from his youthful shell of insecurity, the young man's future swerved wildly through surprising good fortune and soul-shattering loss. Though his life would take on a wide international scope, he remained solidly rooted to his small community in Milestone, Alberta, often more comfortable down in the dark grease pit of his shabby car repair business in Milestone. The astonishing legend of Johnny Patu is a tale of hope and positivity in a world often deficient in both. It's a story of tragedy and recovery, adversity and triumph, and of taking and giving back. So, I will take any questions that any of you might have regarding the book, or my process, or anything else you might want to ask.
Did you say it was a legend, or was this an actual person that you read about?
It's a legend, but virtually every personality that's in this book is a reflection of somebody that I've known directly or indirectly and had contact with in my life. So it was very easy for me to develop characters along the way. Jean would often say, I know who that is.
Your brother. Your brother is
So,
Ernie.
yeah, it was, it's, what I tried to thread into the whole story though was some credibility and without letting too much out of the bag, Johnny and his partner Ezra end up in the used auto parts business, and they make their fortune that way. And if you were to wonder why, and with the fact that the U.S. cut off all shipments of used parts and cars to Cuba for a period of 25 or 30 years, you start to ask yourself, where did those parts come from? How did they keep those things on the road? It's right here. But
So
yeah,
the cars play a big part in this book?
Actually, cars don't play a big part in the book, but car parts do.
Okay.
And it has more to do with, the storyline has more to do with how somebody can run out of opportunity and embrace another opportunity. And Johnny and his partner Ezra, in the course of their life, for example, they were in trouble with their used car parts business for a long time and were just about going broke. And the stock car racing business got underway. Well, the stock car racing industry, if you were ever around in those days, was basically a demolition derby. So they were able to bolster their business by providing used parts to everything from motors to body parts to transmissions for that whole industry all the way across Canada. Then that dried up, as things do, and then the Cuba business kind of got underway, and so. There was 51 of them built by a fellow by the name of Tucker, who scared the living daylights out of the big three automakers in the States, and they did their best to, he never did manufacturing, manufactured 50 of them. Johnny got one by by chance. And the car, of course, he ended up having it for many years and then reselling it for over $1 million. So he was just a man that part of his life was luck, part of his life was his ability to seek opportunities and seize them. So yeah, it's a life study more than anything. And in the end, not necessarily in the end, but near the end, he
Don't tell
does.
us the end.
Huh?
Don't tell us the
Oh, he
end.
won't know the end. But in the course of his life, after being so successful in his business life, he does give back to his community, and that's just part of his whole life cycle, and that's part of the story. Anyone else? Darce?
I know when you were writing Buckskin Girl, you sat down to write one story and the narrative took you someplace completely different. So with this one, did you have kind of a clear idea of where you wanted to go with it, or what was your process?
You're all going to kind of laugh at this, but it's a true thing, and Gene will attest to it. Somewhere in my little brain, I was laying in bed one day and think, you know, Johnny Patu is kind of a cool name.
We were having coffee.
That's it. And I just, Johnny Patu is a cool name. And the story actually evolved from that single name. So I had no clue. Well, I had a clue once I started writing the story. I didn't go blind into it, but yeah, so, yeah.
Where'd the name come from? It's popular. You're like, Johnny the Jew.
Yeah, yeah.
It's in the book.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to spell it that way? Just to confuse booksellers?
Because it, part of the reason that he acquired that name was because of an act of spitting.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
We all, without letting too much out of the bag, it's like what's the sound? How would you spell?
Yeah.
So yeah,
that is the first thing you think of when you read that.
Well, and most people that have actually looked at the title on the front page, their brain goes right there to that. That's a spitting sound. So, anyone else?
So maybe you could tell us how you actually print a book, like once you actually have it written on your, did you say typewriter?
Well, it could no.
No, on your computer. How does it get off the computer into a story?
Well, the first two books, I've got to give Gwen a boost up here. They have an awesome graphic designer over at Warwick, and so he took my manuscript and laid it into proper book format. And that was the third book actually. And then for the fourth book, I actually went out and invested in a program for making up books, like it's called Vellum. So I was able to give the printer the finished Vellum file. And so before that, I worked with an operation called, they're connected with Kindle, and it's called KDP Publishing. And so you have to actually, in that case, I actually went on to P5, I think. Anyway, it's a marketplace for graphic designers, and you just tell them what you want to get done.
Oh,
and
Fiverr.
5RR, yeah. And you just key in what you need done, and within a day, you've got 100 responses of, you know, we'll do this for you, we'll do that for you. So the guy that actually designed the first two books that went to KDP for printing, was actually from Morocco.
Wow.
Believe it or not. So this is like a real international thing, but it was a live and learn process for sure. You know, I did the manuscript before I even had a clue where I was going to go with it or what I was going to do with it. And you know, you find out how to source these things, like the graphic design part, and you know, the guy from Morocco and I say the guy, but it's a blind situation where I didn't even, maybe I was talking online with a woman or a guy, I don't know. All I know is this person was from Morocco, and I tried to open up a personal dialogue with this person, but you couldn't do it. 5R doesn't allow you to have any direct outside of their format, so.
Maybe talk about your other printer? Is she sitting right here?
Oh yeah, Klaus did a much better job. Yeah, well, it actually was nice to have somebody close and in town that you're working with. You do appreciate that, and you know, somebody that you can, you know, if they're not doing what you want, you can actually walk down to their place and face them. So that's always good.
So that was Warwick?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What we've found is in talking to local authors is like some people, it's like their books are printed in China or England or whatever, and they have no control over it. And then other people like have 100% control over it. And there's a trade-off because it tends to be more, the more control you have, the more you've spent on the book. But I think you might be our only author that actually printed your book here in the city. So like it's actually homegrown. So from Warwick, and Gwen is here tonight from Warwick. So that's
There's
fantastic.
some serious arm twisting on there.
Well, but like I didn't even know like a year ago that was a possibility that you could have a book printed in Lethbridge.
Yeah.
You know, and I've found since like we got one from the university the other day, and I said, "Oh, did you have this printed at the university?" And they're like, "Well, we could, but we didn't."
Yeah.
Okay. If you're not using them, who is?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's really
Well,
nice.
actually, you know, there is a broad spectrum of what people do, and I have to admit that my first line was to find a publisher, and that was just an impossible task. They were just. I had a guy that actually a publisher that told me that he didn't want my work published. He got back to me. So.
But he liked the story.
So anyway, the thing with us though, with Jane and I, is we treat this thing really holistically. Like we're kind of into it for the whole ball of wax, right from this to the actual printing, the physical, you know, getting the books right, fighting with your wife over editing issues, and you know, it's all like to us it is the holistic thing. I don't think I'd be comfortable anymore just writing a manuscript and handing it off to a publisher and letting them run with it. I'm not a control freak, but this is more fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It stays if I your words and not somebody else's words coming into what you're
Yeah.
trying to say, and she knows your words.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too is that like nowadays, like a lot of publishers are really genre oriented, and you can look at all four of my books, and if they fit in any genre, I challenge you to fit in any real particular type genre. It's not fantasy. It's not crime. It's, you know, and it's odd that becomes a thing, but I think publishers like uniformity. They don't want to have an author signing up for a second book that just comes from some crazy place, you know. So they like to know what they're dealing with, I guess. And the other thing that, you know, like we've been kind of reading a little bit as we go along, but now And I got no problems with sensitivity, but now some of these publishers are actually hiring sensitivity editors. Really, I mean, really? Like, so it's, I don't consider myself insensitive, but I wouldn't want somebody telling me that, you know, gee, I don't think that's gonna wash with so-and-so or so-and-so. So, you know, it's gotten a little, to me, it's gotten a little silly. Like, this book, for example, like, it takes place in the 40s and 50s, the early part of it. And the thing is, people thought different back then. People talked different. They had, you know, you could call somebody an ethnic name and it'd probably be your best friend for all, but it was just the way people interacted. And so when you write in that particular time frame, you have to, especially when your work has got a lot of dialogue, which mine does, you've got to use the dialogue of the day. And so sometimes sensitivity would really interfere with that.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, now that you've invested in this software program, Vellum, I'm wondering if book 5 is already started.
Yeah. I haven't moved it to a point of where it's, but it's kind of about. It's actually started out kind of as a little short story, and I'm working on it and playing with it a little bit, and I just don't know if it's got the legs to be a book, but it's about a fellow that passes away. He's in about mid-60s, and he passes away, and of course he leaves a widow behind and an ex-wife. And the widow and the ex-wife actually get along fairly well. You know, they know one another and they tolerate each other, and so in the course of them getting together for coffee after the funeral service and memorial, they started cooking up a plan where they're gonna maybe move into the basement of their son-in-law and son and daughter-in-law. So they start cooking up an idea to get that in place. So I see Golden Girls written all over this, but I'm trying not to go there. So it could be fun, but I kind of hit a roadblock with it right now. So I don't know. But yeah, I don't want to waste the software.
What about entering competitions and that, your experience with that?
Yeah, that's another thing if you're self-publishing is there are a lot of competitions open for self-publishers, but you've got to be like really, really careful about that because a lot of them are asking for money up front, like $30 or $50 or something to enter a competition, which is just basically found out the hard way is pretty much a money grab. Some of them are legit, some of them are not legit. For my first book, which isn't up here, The Boy Who Couldn't Die, I actually won an award from a competition down in the States. And it was one of the legit ones, but boy, you gotta sift through a lot of bad ones to get there. So, and you can spend a lot of money on entry fees and whatever, so. The best thing is to look at things like CDC's got a program for writers, and you know, if you look at those and know that they're pretty legit, and you know, they don't ask for a whole lot of, they may ask for $20-25 up front to cover their costs, but you know, when you're sending 3 to 5 books to somebody to read and you're not getting them back, and you never hear from them again, it's kind of tough. We learned the hard way which ones to ignore and which ones not to, you know. So there's a table up there. If I think quite a few of you already have the book tonight. I am gonna do a book signing, so, and I'm doing a book signing for all 3 of these books, so if there's one that you haven't got or would like tonight, or Johnny the 2, then be glad to help you out with that.
There's some refreshments. If anyone needs the washroom, just go to the kids section and turn and you'll find that. And yeah, anything that anything you'd like, just let me know.
Just browse through the store and
Yeah.
enjoy the evening.
And you're welcome to just stay and visit by all means. So thank you so much, Rick. That was fun. That was delightful.
It was much easier when I was rehearsing with my 2 stuffed rabbits at the kitchen table this afternoon. Yeah.
You started a little slow, but you got a full house.